Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Welcome to a quiet night, a time when the world slows down and our minds drift into stories hidden within the shadows. Tonight, let's dive into a tale that will accompany your sleep. A story about silence, about something that seems ordinary, yet holds secrets beyond imagination. Sit back, take a deep breath, and let these words guide you to a house on the outskirts of town. A house that looks like any other, until you realize there is something always watching from the window. A doll, motionless, voiceless, yet every time you look, something feels different. Close your eyes and listen. This is not just a story. This is a journey into a darkness unseen. My name is Henry. I had just moved into a new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place far removed from the noise and chaos of the city. The house was modest but comfortable, with a small front yard and an old wooden fence that had seen better days. I had chosen this place because I longed for solitude, a break from the fast-paced life I had grown weary of. I wasn't much of a social person, preferring my own company over that of others, so a quiet neighborhood suited me just fine. The first few days in my new home were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, arranging my furniture, and getting used to the silence that felt so foreign compared to my previous life. At night, the neighborhood was eerily still, with only the occasional rustling of leaves or distant barking of a dog breaking the quiet. It was peaceful, but at times it felt almost too quiet, as if the silence itself was watching me. My nearest neighbor was an elderly man named Mr. Blake. His house was the oldest on the street, a large Victorian-style building with faded paint and wooden shutters that always seemed to be closed. The house had an air of abandonment, as if it had been frozen in time, untouched by the world outside. The garden was overgrown, the grass tall and wild, and an old oak tree in his front yard stretched its gnarled branches toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I didn't know much about Mr. Blake at first. The few neighbors I had met spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices tinged with unease whenever his name was mentioned. They told me he had lived in that house for decades, long before most of them had moved in. He rarely left his home, and when he did, it was only at odd hours, late at night or in the early hours of dawn when the streets were empty. No one knew much about his past, and no one dared to ask. There were rumors, of course, strange whispers about his family and his life before he became a recluse, but nothing concrete. I had only seen him a few times, always from a distance. He was a tall, thin man with a hunched back and pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the dim streetlights. His silver hair was unkempt, and his eyes, deep-set and shadowed, had an unsettling intensity about them. Each time our paths crossed, he would simply nod at me, his lips curling into a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and then he would disappear back into the shadows of his house. But what intrigued me the most about Mr. Blake's house was the window on the second floor. Unlike the rest of the house, which was always shrouded in darkness, this particular window was different. The curtains were drawn back, just enough to reveal a single object sitting on the windowsill, a doll. The doll was old, its porcelain face cracked in places, its painted eyes dull and lifeless. It wore a faded blue dress with lace trim, and its dark, matted hair hung loosely around its face. It was the kind of doll one might find in an antique shop or an old attic, forgotten and covered in dust. But the most disturbing thing about it was that it never seemed to be in the same position. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Perhaps the shadows were playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just the angle from which I was looking. But as the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes. One evening, I saw the doll sitting perfectly upright, its hands resting neatly on its lap. The next morning, it was leaning slightly to one side, its head tilted as if observing the world outside. Another night, I swore it had turned slightly toward my house, its lifeless eyes fixed in my direction. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing games with me. But a part of me couldn't shake the unease that crept into my thoughts whenever I saw that doll. It was just a toy, an inanimate object, and yet it felt wrong. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, trying to unwind. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the street. The neighborhood was silent as always, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves. My eyes wandered to Mr. Blake's window, as they often did, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. The doll was there, as expected, but this time, something was different. It wasn't just leaning slightly or tilted in a different direction. It had moved. It was now pressed against the glass, its porcelain hands resting on the window pane, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And its eyes, those dull, lifeless eyes, seemed to be staring directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. My grip tightened around my coffee cup, my pulse quickening. I blinked, hoping that when I opened my eyes again, the doll would be back in its usual position, that this was just another trick of the light. But it wasn't. It was still there, still staring. A movement in the shadows caught my attention. I shifted my gaze slightly and saw Mr. Blake standing in his yard, half hidden by the thick branches of the oak tree. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the empty street. Then, ever so slowly, he raised a hand and waved. There was something about the gesture that sent a shiver through me. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was deliberate, almost expectant. I quickly stood up, spilling some of my coffee in the process. My nerves were on edge, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to go inside, to lock my doors and shut my curtains. Without another glance at Mr. Blake or the doll, I turned on my heels and stepped into my house, bolting the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows made me flinch. The image of that doll pressed against the glass burned into my mind, along with the way Mr. Blake had watched me from the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through my curtains, I hesitated before looking outside. Part of me didn't want to see that window, didn't want to confirm what I already knew. But curiosity won over fear, and I slowly stepped onto my porch, my gaze drifting toward Mr. Blake's house. The doll was back in its usual spot, sitting neatly on the windowsill as if it had never moved. But I knew better. I should have packed my things and left right then and there. I should have listened to the uneasy feeling in my gut, the voice in my head screaming at me to get out while I still could. But I didn't, and that was my first mistake. I tried to convince myself that everything I had seen the night before was just a trick of my imagination. Maybe I was exhausted from all the moving and unpacking. Maybe the dim light had played tricks on my eyes. Maybe, just maybe, the doll hadn't moved at all, and my mind had fabricated the whole thing out of stress and fatigue. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. For the next few days, I made a conscious effort to avoid looking at Mr. Blake's house. Every time I walked past my window, I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, refusing to glance at that second-floor window where the doll always sat. It wasn't easy. My curiosity gnawed at me, an unbearable itch that begged to be scratched. But I ignored it. I wanted nothing to do with that house. However, avoiding something doesn't make it go away. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught myself hesitating before closing my curtains. The urge to check the window across the street was too strong. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, a gentle nudge urging me to just take one look. What harm could it do? Giving in to my weakness, I took a deep breath and walked over to the window. With my heart pounding, I peered outside. The doll was still there, sitting on the windowsill. But something was different. It had changed position again. This time, it was slumped forward slightly, as if it had been tossed carelessly onto the windowsill rather than carefully placed there. Its porcelain hands rested on the wooden frame, its cracked face angled downward. But what made my stomach twist with unease was that the doll's head was tilted directly toward my house. It was looking at me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I immediately stepped away from the window, pulling the curtains shut with trembling hands. My breathing was shallow, my skin prickling with an unsettling sense of dread. I climbed into bed and pulled the blankets up to my chin, telling myself that it didn't mean anything. It was just a doll, an inanimate object. Yet, I slept with the light on that night. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy fog. I went about my day as usual, drinking coffee, checking emails, and unpacking the last of my moving boxes. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I almost managed to convince myself that I had overreacted. That was until I stepped outside. The moment I walked onto my porch, I felt it, a presence, an undeniable sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned my head toward Mr. Blake's house. My stomach dropped. The doll was gone. I stared at the empty windowsill, my mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe Mr. Blake had finally moved it. Maybe he had thrown it away. Maybe. A soft thud echoed from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My heart was pounding as I scanned my porch, my yard, the quiet street. Nothing. There was no one there. But then my eyes fell to my feet. The doll was sitting on my porch. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossible. It had been in Mr. Blake's window just last night. There was no way it could be here. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The cracks in its porcelain face resembled spiderwebs, delicate yet deep. Its painted eyes were chipped, giving it an eerie, hollow expression. The dress it wore, once blue, was now faded and stained with age. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe some kids had taken it as a prank. Maybe it had fallen from the window, and the wind had somehow carried it here. It didn't make sense, but I clung to any explanation that didn't involve the alternative, that the doll had moved on its own. Not knowing what else to do, I grabbed the doll and carried it back across the street. My hands felt clammy as I approached Mr. Blake's house. The air around it seemed colder than the rest of the neighborhood, as if the house itself rejected warmth. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. I knocked again. Still nothing. For a moment, I considered just leaving the doll on the porch and walking away. But something about that idea felt wrong, almost disrespectful, like I was inviting trouble. Just as I was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Mr. Blake stood there, staring at me with that same unreadable expression. Up close, he looked even older than I had thought. His skin was stretched thin over his sharp cheekbones, his eyes sunken and clouded with age. He didn't blink, didn't say a word. I forced a smile and held up the doll. "I think this belongs to you," I said, my voice coming out weaker than I had intended. For a long moment, he just looked at me. Then slowly, his lips curled into a smile. "Oh," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It seems she's taken a liking to you." I stiffened. "Excuse me." His eyes flickered to the doll, then back to me. "She doesn't leave the house unless she wants to." A chill crawled up my spine. I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort. "Well, she must have gotten out somehow. Here." I extended the doll toward him. Mr. Blake didn't take it. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. "You should keep her," he said. "She's chosen you." My stomach twisted. "No, really, The door slammed shut. I stood there, gripping the doll, my breath coming in shallow gasps. What the hell had just happened? I turned on my heel and walked back to my house, my pace quicker than I intended. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me. My hands were trembling as I stared down at the doll. "She's chosen you." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a deep, gnawing unease. I didn't want this thing. I didn't want anything to do with it. Without another thought, I tossed the doll into a box in the corner of my living room and shut the lid. Out of sight, out of mind. Or so I thought. That night, I awoke to a sound. A soft scraping noise. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, scrape. It was coming from the living room. I held my breath, my body frozen in fear. Slowly, I climbed out of bed, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. I moved cautiously toward the living room, every muscle in my body tense. The box. The lid was open. The doll was gone. I stood frozen in the dim light of my living room, my breath shallow and uneven. The box where I had placed the doll was wide open, its lid resting beside it, as if it had been deliberately removed. My heart pounded against my ribs as my eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of movement. The doll was gone. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my panic at bay. Maybe the lid hadn't been closed all the way, and maybe, somehow, the doll had fallen out. That had to be it. There was no other explanation. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the street lamp outside, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. My gaze swept over the furniture, the corners, the darkened spaces where the light didn't reach. But there was no sign of the doll. A sudden chill prickled at my skin, and for the first time since moving into this house, I felt truly unsafe. I took another slow step, my hands clenching into fists. Then, from the far corner of the room, something shifted. I spun around, my eyes locking onto the source of the movement. The doll. It was sitting upright in the middle of my couch. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I knew I hadn't placed it there. I knew I had locked it inside the box just hours ago. And yet, there it was, as if it had been watching me the entire time. Its cracked porcelain face was frozen in its usual vacant expression, but something about it felt different. It wasn't just a doll anymore. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be here. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I forced myself to step closer. My hands trembled as I reached out, hesitating just inches away from its tiny body. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to feel the cold porcelain against my skin, but I needed to get rid of it. Just as my fingers brushed against the fabric of its dress, a soft sound filled the room. A whisper. Barely audible, but unmistakable. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. My head snapped toward the hallway. expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The house was empty. At least, it should have been. The whispering continued, growing just slightly louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like a breath against my ear, a voice that wasn't entirely there. I grabbed the doll and, with shaking hands, rushed toward the front door. I wasn't going to let it stay in my house another second. I flung open the door, stepping onto the porch with hurried, uneven breaths. The night air was cold, but I barely noticed. I needed to get rid of this thing. My first thought was to leave it on Mr. Blake's porch. I had tried to return it once before, and he had refused. But this time I didn't care. He could deal with whatever was going on. I just wanted it gone. I crossed the street quickly, glancing at his darkened windows. The second-floor window, the one where the doll had always been, was still empty. The house was as lifeless as ever. As I climbed the steps to his porch, I hesitated. The air around his house felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't name. The porch light flickered faintly, barely illuminating the warped wooden planks beneath my feet. I knelt down and placed the doll in front of his door, my fingers barely brushing the fabric as I let go. I straightened up and took a step back, half expecting the door to swing open, for Mr. Blake to be standing there with that eerie, knowing smile. But nothing happened. Silence. The house remained as still as ever. Relief washed over me as I turned to leave. I had done my part. The doll was back where it belonged. But just as I stepped off the porch, something made me stop. A sound, faint, like a child's laughter. I spun around, my pulse racing. The doll was no longer sitting in front of the door. It was gone. I took an instinctive step back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had it fallen? Had someone taken it? Then I saw it. The second-floor window. The doll was back in its usual spot, sitting on the windowsill, facing forward as if it had never left. I stumbled back, my chest tight with fear. This wasn't possible. It wasn't just a trick of my imagination. It was real. The doll had moved. It had returned on its own. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my house, the door locked behind me. My breaths came fast and ragged, my hands shaking as I pressed my back against the door. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had put the doll on his porch. I had turned away for mere seconds, and it had somehow returned to that window. This wasn't normal. This wasn't rational. Something was very, very wrong. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to calm my frantic thoughts. Maybe, just maybe, Mr. Blake had been watching and had moved the doll himself. Maybe he had been standing just out of sight, waiting for me to leave before placing it back where it had always been. But that didn't explain the laughter. And it didn't explain why the air in my house suddenly felt so suffocating. I decided then and there that I couldn't stay here any longer. Tomorrow I would leave. I didn't care if I had just moved in. I didn't care if breaking my lease would cost me money. None of it mattered anymore. I needed to get away from this place. That night I barely slept. I kept the lights on, my ears straining for any sound, my body tense beneath the blankets. But the house remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that exhaustion finally overtook me, pulling me into an uneasy sleep. And that was when the nightmare came. I was standing in my living room, but the walls were wrong. They pulsed as if they were alive, breathing in and out in slow, rhythmic motions. The air was thick and humid, pressing down on me like a weight. Shadows flickered across the floor, twisting and contorting into shapes I couldn't quite make out. Then I heard it, the whispering. It was louder now, clearer. The words slithered through the air, wrapping around me like invisible tendrils. She's chosen you. A chill crawled up my spine. Then, from the shadows, something moved. The doll. It was walking toward me. Not being carried. Not sliding. Walking. Its porcelain feet tapped lightly against the floor, its arms swaying slightly with each step. The cracks in its face seemed deeper now, almost like a grin stretching across its features. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The doll stopped just inches from me, its head tilted to the side, its hollow eyes staring straight into mine. Then it spoke. A single word, barely above a whisper. Stay. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the shadows long and looming. My hands clenched the sheets, my entire body trembling. It was just a dream. But as I turned my head, my stomach dropped. The doll was sitting at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as my gaze locked onto the doll sitting at the foot of my bed. The dim glow from the street lamp outside cast eerie shadows across its cracked porcelain face. The tiny figure sat still, its hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I felt paralyzed, my body refusing to respond as my mind screamed for me to run. I hadn't placed it there. I knew that for certain. I had left it on Mr. Blake's porch. It had somehow returned to my home, sitting inches away from me in the dead of night. The nightmare I had woken from clung to my consciousness like cobwebs, leaving behind a sense of dread so thick it was suffocating. Had I imagined the doll's voice in my dream? Had it really whispered that word? Stay? I forced myself to move, my muscles tense and rigid. With slow, deliberate motions, I pulled my legs back, inching away from the doll without breaking eye contact. Every part of me screamed not to look away. Then, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I grabbed the doll and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening thud, landing face down on the wooden floor. My breath came fast and shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. For several agonizing moments, I just sat there, staring at the fallen figure, waiting, expecting it to move. It didn't. The room remained silent, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I could feel sweat gathering at my temples, a cold chill creeping down my spine. I had to get rid of it. This time, I wouldn't just leave it on Mr. Blake's porch. I would burn it, smash it, anything to make sure it never came back. Without hesitation, I climbed out of bed and grabbed the doll from the floor, gripping it tightly in my shaking hands. Its porcelain skin was cold, unnaturally so, like something that had never been touched by warmth. I didn't care how late it was. I stormed outside, my bare feet cold against the pavement as I made my way to the small fire pit in my backyard. My hands fumbled as I threw some dry kindling into the pit and reached for the box of matches I kept nearby. With trembling fingers, I struck a match. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting shadows across the doll's unmoving face. I stared at it for a moment, an irrational fear clawing at the edges of my mind. And then I dropped the match. The fire roared to life, flames consuming the kindling. Without giving myself time to hesitate, I threw the doll into the fire and stepped back, watching as the flames licked at its faded dress, curling the fabric into blackened ash. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. The fire flickered, not like a normal gust of wind disturbing it, but in a strange, unnatural way, like something was resisting it. The flames sputtered, struggling to spread across the doll's surface. I watched in growing horror as the porcelain remained intact, the heat seemingly unable to touch it. My chest tightened. This wasn't possible. Desperate, I grabbed a metal poker and jabbed at the doll, trying to break it apart to make sure it burned. But the moment the poker touched its surface, a sharp, piercing shriek split the air. I stumbled back, my heart nearly stopping. The sound wasn't coming from me. It wasn't coming from anywhere human. It was a high-pitched, unnatural wail that sent ice through my veins, a scream of something that should not be. And then, the fire died. Just like that, the flames were gone, snuffed out as if they had never been lit in the first place. The air was suddenly heavy with silence, the acrid smell of burned fabric lingering in the cold night. I looked down. The doll sat at the bottom of the fire pit, untouched. No scorch marks, no cracks, nothing. It had survived. I staggered backward, a raw, choking fear clawing at my throat. This wasn't just a haunted object. It wasn't just some eerie old toy. It was something else, something wrong. I couldn't stay here. Without wasting another second, I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. My breaths came in quick, uneven gasps, my mind reeling. I had to figure out what was going on. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. And there was only one place I could think of that might have answers. The town library. The next morning, I wasted no time. I barely slept after the events of the night before, my mind racing with questions and terror. I needed to find out more about Mr. Blake, about the doll, about whatever the hell was happening to me. The town library was old, its stone facade worn and cracked with age. Inside, the scent of dust and aging paper filled the air. The shelves lined with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. I approached the front desk, where an elderly librarian sat flipping through a newspaper. She barely glanced up as I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm looking for any old records on the houses in my neighborhood, specifically my street." The librarian peered at me over her glasses, her expression unreadable. "That area," she muttered. "Not much to find, I imagine. People don't like talking about it." My stomach twisted. "Why not?" She sighed, setting the newspaper aside. "Strange happenings. People moving in and out. Some disappearing altogether." She eyed me curiously. "You live there now, don't you?" I nodded slowly. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you trying to find?" I hesitated, considering how much to tell her. Finally, I said, "My neighbor, Mr. Blake, and a doll that belonged to him." At the mention of his name, the librarian stiffened. A heavy silence settled between us before she finally whispered, "You need to leave that place." My heart pounded. "Why?" She reached under the desk, pulling out an old, yellowed newspaper. She slid it toward me, tapping a particular article with her wrinkled finger. I glanced down and felt my blood turn to ice. The headline read, "Family found missing in mysterious circumstances. Only doll remains." I scanned the article, my hands trembling. It was dated nearly 30 years ago. A family had lived in my house before me, a mother, a father, and their young daughter. One day, they vanished without a trace. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. The only thing left behind was a doll, sitting in the center of their living room. My mind reeled. I turned back to the librarian. "Mr. Blake," I said hurriedly. "Who is he?" She exhaled sharply, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "He was the only one who ever survived." I felt my stomach drop. The librarian continued, her voice barely audible. "Every family that's lived there, they all disappear. But he's been here forever. And that doll," she shook her head. "It's not just any doll. It's a warning, a mark. Once it chooses you." Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. I already knew. I had been marked. and I didn't have much time left. The librarian's words echoed in my mind as I stumbled out of the library, my hands trembling. Every family that's lived there, they all disappear. But he's been here forever. And that doll? It's not just any doll. It's a warning, a mark. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets as I hurried home, my pulse pounding. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Something was very wrong with Mr. Blake and that damn doll. It wasn't just an eerie antique. It wasn't just moving on its own. It was choosing its victims. And now it had chosen me. I gritted my teeth, fighting against the wave of panic threatening to consume me. No, I refused to be another nameless person who vanished without a trace. If Mr. Blake was behind this, if he knew what was happening, I had to confront him. But how? Would he even answer my questions? Would he even tell me the truth? I had to try. By the time I reached my street, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and deep purple. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. My house stood silent and still, but I didn't look at it. I didn't want to. Instead, I turned my gaze to the house next door, the decaying, foreboding structure that belonged to Mr. Blake. His windows, as always, were shut, save for one. And the doll was there, perched in the same spot, facing my house, facing me. I clenched my fists. Enough was enough. With a deep breath, I marched up the creaking wooden steps of Mr. Blake's porch and raised my fist to knock. The wood felt cold beneath my knuckles as I rapped against the door. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. More silence. I was about to turn away when the door suddenly creaked open. Mr. Blake stood in the doorway. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He looked exactly as he always had, gaunt face, deep-set eyes, a thin-lipped smile that never quite reached them. But now, as I stood in front of him, something felt off. It wasn't just the unsettling aura he always carried. It was something deeper. He had been expecting me. "Henry," he said at last, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "I was wondering when you'd come." His words sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't even ask why I was here. He knew. I swallowed hard, pushing past the fear clawing at my chest. "I need answers," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "About the doll. About this house. About you." Mr. Blake chuckled softly, stepping aside and gesturing toward the dimly lit interior. "Then come in," he said. "Let's talk." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to step inside. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. The inside of his house was even worse than I had imagined. It was dark. The air smelled musty, like old wood and something else, something rotten. The furniture was sparse, coated in a thin layer of dust. Heavy curtains blocked out what little sunlight remained, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But the worst part, the dolls. They were everywhere, lining the shelves, propped against the walls, sitting in chairs, dozens, maybe even hundreds of them. Some were porcelain, others made of cloth or wood. Some were pristine, while others were cracked, missing eyes or limbs. And all of them seemed to be watching. I swallowed back the rising nausea in my throat. Mr. Blake moved slowly, leading me to a small sitting area where an old, candlelit table stood. He gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, but eventually lowered myself onto the creaky wooden chair. He sat across from me, his fingers steepled together. For a long moment, he simply observed me, as if debating how much to say. Finally, he spoke. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You've felt it." I clenched my fists. "The doll," I said. "It moves on its own. It came back to my house after I got rid of it. His lips curled into something that was neither a smile nor a frown. Of course it did, he murmured. It doesn't belong to me anymore. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? He sighed, as if he had explained this 100 times before. It chooses its owner, and once it does, it stays with them. His gaze darkened, until it doesn't need them anymore. A chill crept up my spine. What happens when it doesn't need them anymore? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Blake leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim candlelight. They disappear, he said. A thick silence settled between us, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. They just vanish? I asked, my throat dry. He nodded. One by one. No traces. No explanation. Just gone. My stomach twisted. And you? I demanded. Why are you still here? Why hasn't it taken you? For the first time, something flickered across his face, something almost like sorrow. I was the first, he said, a long time ago, and I was the only one who found a way to stay. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating. I shook my head, my thoughts spinning. There has to be a way to stop it, I said desperately. To break whatever this is. Mr. Blake's expression darkened. There is no stopping it, he said. Once it has chosen you, there is only one way out. I tensed. What way? His lips parted as if to answer. But then, a thud echoed through the house. We both froze. Another thud, closer this time. Then, a whisper, low, almost inaudible, like wind through cracked walls. Henry. A shudder tore through me. I turned my head slowly toward the hallway. The darkness beyond the candlelight seemed to breathe. And then I saw it. A small figure stood just beyond the reach of the flickering light. The doll. It was standing, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I shot to my feet, my chair scraping against the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs as the whisper came again, closer this time. Henry, stay. Mr. Blake grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. His face was grim, his expression unreadable. It's too late, he murmured. I ripped my arm free and stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to get out. The shadows in the hallway shifted. The doll moved, and then the candles flickered, and the room was swallowed by darkness. Darkness consumed the room, thick and absolute. My breath hitched as the candlelight sputtered out, plunging everything into an eerie silence. I could feel my pulse hammering against my ribs, every muscle in my body locking up as if the air itself had turned to ice. Then movement, a slow, deliberate creak of the wooden floor. Not from Mr. Blake, from the hallway, from it, the doll. A whisper slithered through the silence, a raspy, childlike voice. Henry. I stumbled backward, my legs knocking against the chair I had been sitting in just moments before. My fingers scrambled for something, anything, to hold on to, but there was nothing but the overwhelming emptiness of the dark. Mr. Blake, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. But he was silent. A suffocating dread coiled around my lungs as I realized I couldn't hear him moving. No shuffling, no breath, no sound at all. My hands darted out in the dark, trying to feel where he was. But there was nothing. Mr. Blake. I tried again, louder this time, panic creeping into my voice. A hand clamped down on my wrist. I barely swallowed the scream rising in my throat as I jerked away, my feet stumbling beneath me. But before I could fully react, the fingers tightened, cold as death. It's too late, Mr. Blake's voice rasped, but something about it was wrong. His grip was firmer than before, his fingers digging into my skin in a way that sent every nerve in my body screaming in alarm. Let me go, I gasped, wrenching my arm free and stumbling back. The whispering continued, weaving through the darkness. The doll's voice, small and insidious, echoing all around me. "Henry, stay with us." I turned toward where the door should be. My only thought was run. But as I moved, something darted in front of me. The darkness shifted. No, it moved. And then, for just a fraction of a second, I saw them. Eyes. Not just from the doll. Eyes, dozens of them, staring at me from the void. Glassy. Unblinking. The dolls. All of them. They were no longer sitting still. They were watching. A strangled gasp tore from my throat as I shoved forward, my hands outstretched. My fingers collided with something. Rough, wooden. It was the edge of a table. I grabbed hold of it, feeling my way along, desperate to navigate the space even as the whispers grew louder, as if the air itself was filled with voices. "Henry, stay with us. It's your turn now." A sharp gust of wind blew through the room, icy and unnatural. My skin prickled as I felt something brush past me, something small, impossibly fast. Then laughter. High-pitched, childlike. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just moved. My feet pounded against the floor as I pushed toward the direction I hoped was the front door. The shadows twisted around me, the laughter following, echoing. I crashed into something solid. The front door. My hands fumbled against the handle, clawing, desperate. I twisted it hard. Locked. No. No, no, no. I turned, pressing my back to the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My vision adjusted just enough to see the outlines of the room, the grotesque shapes of the dolls, now closer than before. And in the center of them, the doll. It no longer sat idly by the window. It stood, on its own, head tilted, staring. And then, it moved. One step, then another. The tiny porcelain feet barely made a sound, but I could feel it. Feel the presence of something wrong, something ancient, something that had been waiting so long for me. I slammed my fist against the door. "Let me out," I yelled, my voice hoarse. The doll took another step. Then, the whispering stopped. Everything went silent. And in that moment, the door behind me suddenly flew open. I fell backward, hitting the ground hard. Cold air rushed over me as I scrambled up, my heart in my throat. I turned. My house. I was inside my house. I didn't understand. 1 second, I had been trapped in Mr. Blake's nightmare of a home, and the next I was here, back in my own living room, the air stale and suffocating. I turned sharply toward the front door, still wide open. But outside, there was nothing. Not Mr. Blake's house. Not the street. Just blackness. A void stretching into nothing. My breath hitched as I stepped toward the door, peering into the abyss beyond. My street, my neighbors, my car gone. As if they had never existed. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned. The doll was there, sitting neatly on my coffee table, hands folded in its lap. Waiting. A smile had been carved into its once expressionless face. A grotesque, jagged grin. It had followed me, and I knew in that moment that it wasn't just in my house. I was in its house now, and there was no way out. My breath was ragged as I stood there, frozen, staring at the doll sitting on my coffee table. It hadn't been there before. It hadn't been anywhere before. I had left it behind, in Mr. Blake's house, in that suffocating darkness where it belonged. And yet, here it was, resting neatly in my home like it had never left. Like I had never left. My throat was dry. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the overwhelming sense of nausea twisting in my gut. The doll's face had changed. I was sure of it. Where before it had been expressionless, now it had a grotesque, jagged smile carved into its porcelain skin. It was crude, uneven, as though done by an unsteady hand. The longer I looked at it, the more I felt like the smile was stretching, widening, almost like it was watching me, mocking me. I took a step back. The air in the room was heavy, thick with something wrong. My walls looked the same. My furniture, the dim lighting. Everything was identical to my home. But something was off. The silence, the oppressive weight in the air, the way shadows clung to the corners of the room. This wasn't my home. Not anymore. I needed to move. I needed to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was locked in place, unable to take my eyes off the doll. A deep, primal instinct screamed at me, warning me not to turn my back on it. Then, it twitched. Not much, just a tiny jerk of its hand, barely noticeable. But I saw it. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. My legs hit the edge of the couch, and I nearly collapsed. The whispering started again, low, faint, like the murmurs of a distant conversation happening just out of earshot. It was everywhere, all around me, seeping from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Henry. My chest tightened. My own name, spoken so softly, yet it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I needed to get out. With a sharp inhale, I forced my body to move. My feet hit the hardwood floor as I turned toward the door, gripping the handle with clammy fingers. I twisted, locked. Of course. I yanked harder, my panic rising. It wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder. Henry, why are you leaving? Don't go. Stay with us. I spun around, pressing my back against the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shadows in the room had grown darker, longer. And the doll. It was closer. Still seated, still perfectly poised on the coffee table. But now it was facing me directly. I hadn't seen it move. I would have seen it move. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing this nightmare to end. This isn't real. This isn't real. A sharp noise broke through the silence, a scraping, like nails dragging across wood. My eyes snapped open. The doll's head was tilted now, its grotesque smile unmoving, but its tiny porcelain fingers had shifted. One hand rested on the table. The other hung just over the edge, its fingertips scratching against the wooden surface. Scrape, scrape, scrape. My stomach twisted. My legs were shaking. I had to get out. If the door wouldn't open, I needed to try something else. I turned sharply toward the windows. If I had to break one, so be it. But they weren't there. My breath caught in my throat. The walls where my windows should have been were bare. No glass, no frames, no sign that they had ever existed at all. I staggered backward, my vision swimming. No, this wasn't possible. This wasn't real. I ran toward the kitchen, my fingers scrambling for my phone in my pocket. Maybe I could call someone, anyone. But when I pulled it out, the screen was black. Dead. I pressed the power button. Nothing. Then, the whispering stopped. For a long moment, the silence was deafening. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest. Then a voice, clear and sharp, shattered the stillness. Henry. My stomach lurched. That voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was Mr. Blake. I spun around. He stood in the doorway of my kitchen, his expression unreadable. His presence didn't bring relief, only a fresh wave of dread. He was here, in my house. Or, no, this wasn't my house. Somehow, I was still trapped in his. Mr. Blake, I gasped, my voice shaking. What's happening? What is this? His dark eyes flickered toward the doll on the coffee table. He regarded it with something I couldn't quite place. Recognition, maybe even something close to sadness. It's begun, he murmured. You need to understand, Henry. This isn't about me. It never was. It's about it. He turned his gaze back to me. And now it's about you. I shook my head, my breaths coming fast and uneven. What the hell are you talking about? What does it want? Mr. Blake took a slow step forward. To replace. A chill ran down my spine. Replace what? His lips parted, but before he could answer, the lights flickered violently, plunging us in and out of darkness. The walls groaned, shifting, twisting like the house itself was alive. The whispering returned, but now it wasn't distant. It was everywhere. And then, something grabbed my ankle. I barely had time to scream before I was yanked downward, my body slamming into the floor. My vision blurred as my nails clawed at the hardwood, trying to hold on. Hands, small, cold, countless hands, were pulling at me, dragging me toward the darkness under the coffee table. I thrashed, kicked, fought, but the more I struggled, the stronger they became. The last thing I saw before I was pulled under was the doll, sitting perfectly still, its hollow, soulless eyes locked onto mine, and its grin stretching ever so slightly wider. The darkness swallowed me whole. I thrashed, my fingers clawing at the floor, but the hands dragging me downward were too strong. They were small, frail yet unnaturally powerful, gripping my arms, my legs, my waist, pulling me into an abyss that shouldn't exist beneath my coffee table. My screams were muffled by the void. My vision blurred as I spiraled downward, deeper into something that had no end, no logic, no escape. The world around me twisted, the walls bending and stretching in ways that defied reality. I saw flashes, glimpses of something ancient, something that had been watching, waiting. Then suddenly, silence. The pulling stopped. I landed hard on a cold, wooden floor, gasping for breath. The air was thick and stale, filled with the scent of dust and decay. My body ached from the impact, but nothing was broken. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, trying to steady my breath. Where was I? I looked around. The space was dimly lit by an eerie, bluish glow emanating from the walls. The room was old, like an abandoned attic, the floor covered in dust, cobwebs stretching from corner to corner. And then I saw them, the dolls, rows upon rows of them, seated neatly on wooden shelves that lined the walls. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Their glassy eyes reflected the pale light, their small hands resting stiffly in their laps. Some were missing limbs, others had cracked porcelain faces, but all of them were watching. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. The whispering returned, faint at first, then growing louder, swirling all around me like a chorus of unseen voices. Henry. I whipped around. Mr. Blake stood at the far end of the room, his expression unreadable. But he looked different. His skin was paler, his posture rigid, unnatural. His lips curled into a thin smile, but his eyes were hollow. "You should not have come here," he said softly. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry, my limbs trembling. "Where am I?" He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "You are where the others were before you." "The others?" My voice barely came out. "What does that mean? What the hell is happening?" He gestured toward the shelves, toward the endless rows of dolls. "You're looking at them." I froze. My blood turned to ice. No, it wasn't possible. I turned back to the dolls, my mind racing, my breathing uneven. At first glance, they looked like any old porcelain dolls, lifeless, unmoving. But now, staring at them under the cold, dim light, I saw it. Their faces, their features, they weren't just random dolls. They were people. Their faces were too human, too real. A choked breath escaped me. My stomach twisted violently as I realized what I was looking at. They had been alive, and now they were trapped. Forever. I stumbled back, my hands trembling. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Mr. Blake simply tilted his head. It's been real for a very long time. I turned sharply back to him, desperation clawing at my chest. Why? What is this? Why are you doing this? His expression remained eerily calm. Not me, he said. It. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The doll. The one that had appeared in my house. The one that had smiled at me. I looked down, and there it was, sitting at my feet, staring up at me. It had followed me. It had brought me here. I stumbled away from it, shaking my head. No, I won't end up like them. Mr. Blake sighed. I told you, Henry. The doll chooses. It always chooses. I refused to accept it. I refused to become one of them. I turned toward the room, toward any possible exit, but there was nothing. No doors, no windows, just the endless rows of dolls and the soft, distant whispering that seemed to hum inside my bones. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I didn't want to turn around. I shouldn't have turned around. But I did. The doll was standing, not sitting, not motionless. It had risen, its head tilted, its jagged smile wider than before. A sharp pain shot through my limbs. My fingers curled involuntarily, my body seizing up as if an invisible force had wrapped itself around me. My skin tightened, my vision swam, and an unbearable pressure built in my chest. I gasped for air, but it was like my lungs were turning to stone. I looked down. My hands. My skin was hardening, turning pale, turning porcelain. No, I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. I struggled, fought to move, to run, but my legs were locking into place. The whispers grew louder, deafening. Join us, Henry. Stay with us. It's your turn. I turned my eyes toward Mr. Blake, pleading silently for help. But his expression remained empty, resigned. And then I saw it. A crack, thin and jagged, running along the side of his face. His porcelain face. Mr. Blake wasn't human anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. I wanted to scream, but my lips wouldn't move. My jaw had locked in place. My arms, my legs, everything was stiff, unresponsive. The last thing I felt was my body becoming hollow, my insides replaced with something empty, something cold. The last thing I heard was laughter. Not cruel, not loud, just soft, childlike. The doll's laughter. Then, darkness. The next morning, the house stood silent. No sign of struggle. No sign of Henry. Just an empty room. And on the shelf, among the others, sat a new doll. A perfect, lifelike replica. Its face was frozen in a silent scream.